Here's something that sounds impossible today. For about 40 years, the weed that almost every single American smoked was brown, dry, packed with seeds, and squashed into a solid brick. It was harsh, it was weak, and everybody complained about it constantly. It was, by every modern standard, garbage. And yet, it completely dominated this entire country for 2 generations. This wasn't some rare bad batch. This was the default, the thing a bag of weed simply meant for decades. And the story of how it took over, and what it secretly funded, is way bigger than the weed itself. This is the story of Mexican brickweed. So let's start with what this stuff actually was, because if you're under 30, you might have never even seen it. Brickweed was exactly what it sounds like. Cannabis that had been crushed down into a dense, solid block, usually about the size and shape of a brick, weighing a kilo or so. And it wasn't an accident. It was made that way on purpose, for one very specific reason. That reason was smuggling. When you're moving weed by the ton across a border, loose, fluffy bud takes up way too much space. So they ran it through a hydraulic press and crushed it into bricks. That cut the size roughly in half, made it way easier to hide and stack, and let them move a lot more product per trip. It even helped mask the smell. From a smuggler's point of view, it was brilliant. But from a smoker's point of view, it was a disaster. Because that compression came at a serious cost, and that cost was the entire quality of the weed. When you crush cannabis down like that, you're smashing all the trichomes, which are the tiny resin glands that hold the THC and the smell. So the pressing itself damaged it. What you ended up with was a brown or brownish-green slab you had to physically break apart with your hands, or a pair of scissors just to use. And the pressing wasn't even the worst part. Brickweed was absolutely full of seeds and stems, and there's a specific reason for that. It was not grown carefully. They grew it in huge outdoor fields with male and female plants all mixed in together. And when male plants pollinate the female plants stop putting their energy into resin and start making seeds instead. So instead of the seedless, resin-packed bud we have now, you got weak flower loaded with seeds, and you'd spend a good chunk of your time just picking them all out before you could even roll it. So all of that raises one obvious question. Just how weak was this stuff? Well, modern weed usually tests somewhere between 15 and 25% THC. Brickweed was more like 2 to 5%. Some of it tested even lower than that. You basically had to smoke a whole lot more of it just to get anywhere. Now I've got to be honest with you about those numbers, because there's some real dispute here. The government's own testing program back in the 70s reported some samples under 1% THC, which is basically nothing at all. But a lot of experts think those early numbers were misleadingly low, because the samples they tested were mostly old, degraded Mexican bricks that had been sitting around for years, slowly losing their potency. So the real number for fresh, decent brickweed was probably a few percent. Still weak by today's standards, but not quite as pathetic as those old government figures made it sound. So that brings us to the real mystery of this whole story. If it was this weak, seedy, harsh brown garbage, how on earth did it completely dominate America for 40 years? And the answer is actually pretty simple. It was everywhere, and it was cheap. For decades, this was basically the only game in town. By the 1970s, something like 70 to 90% of all the weed in America was coming up from Mexico. And even as recently as 2008, Mexico was still supplying around 2/3 of the weed in this country. And it honestly makes sense too, because Mexico had everything it needed. A long shared border, cheap land, cheap labor, and a warm climate perfect for growing. But the price is really what sealed the deal. This stuff was dirt cheap. We're talking around $50 to $75 an ounce, at a time when the good domestic weed cost several times that much. So for the average person who just wanted to get high without spending a fortune, brickweed was the obvious choice. For an entire generation, a bag of weed simply meant a bag of brown, seedy weed. I even remember when I was younger, my mom told me about how it was so cheap and they would get so much of it for such little cost. Plus, there was really no other option on the table. But besides all that, somebody had to grow all that weed and move it across the border. And this is where the story takes a much darker turn. Because brickweed wasn't just some harmless feel-good hippie thing. It was the original cash crop that built the Mexican cartels. See, before energizing substances was the big moneymaker for them, it was marijuana. And the man who turned it into an empire was a trafficker named Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Around 1980, he took all the scattered Mexican traffickers and organized them into one single coordinated operation, which became known as the Guadalajara Cartel. It was the first real Mexican cartel of its kind, and weed was a massive part of what funded it. And to understand just how industrial this got, you have to look at a place called Rancho Buffalo. This was a gigantic marijuana plantation out in the Mexican desert, run by one of Gallardo's partners. And when I say gigantic, I mean it covered well over 1,000 acres. It had its own irrigation systems and warehouses. And during harvest, it reportedly had something like 7,000 workers living and working on it. It was one of the biggest weed operations the world had ever seen. But that massive operation is exactly what led to the cartel's downfall. Because a DEA agent named Enrique Camarena, who everybody called Kiki, was the one who dug up the intelligence on it. And in November of 1984, acting on that information, the Mexican military raided Rancho Buffalo and burned the entire thing to the ground. It was a devastating blow to the cartel, destroying a fortune in product overnight. And the cartel's response to that raid is one of the darkest moments in the entire drug war. A few months later, in early 1985, they got Kiki Camarena right off the street in broad daylight. And did things YouTube wouldn't allow me to say, but you can search up the details of this tragedy or watch the story on a TV show called Narcos Mexico. But when the news of what happened came out, it completely changed how America dealt with the Mexican drug trade. It turned the DEA into a far bigger and more aggressive force. It eventually led to Gallardo and his partners getting arrested. And it's the very reason Red Ribbon Week exists in schools to this day. All of it traces back to that cheap brown brick weed and the empire built on top of it. Now, the American government had actually been fighting this stuff for years before Camarena, and two of their attempts are really worth knowing about. Both of them backfired in their own way. The first came back in 1969 when the Nixon administration launched something called Operation Intercept. Basically overnight, they started searching almost every single car and person crossing the entire Mexican border, trying to choke off the weed supply at its source. It created absolute chaos, miles-long traffic jams, and it barely caught any actual marijuana at all. But it did send prices shooting up, and it was really the birth of the militarized border we know today. The second attempt actually scared people away from the weed itself. In the late 70s, the US paid to have Mexican marijuana fields sprayed with a poisonous weed killer called paraquat, hoping to destroy the crops. But the farmers just harvested the sprayed weed anyway and shipped it north like nothing happened. So suddenly, there was a real health panic that a lot of the Mexican weed out there might be contaminated with a poison that could seriously damage your lungs. And that fear actually pushed a lot of smokers to start hunting for weed grown at home instead. And that fear is a perfect setup for how brickweed finally ended. Because in the end, it got killed by two things at once: quality and price. The quality blow landed first. Starting in the 70s and really exploding in the 80s and 90s, American growers, especially out in California, mastered growing seedless sinsemilla weed indoors. This was the complete opposite of brickweed. It was potent, it was fresh, it had no seeds, and it smelled incredible. Once people got their first taste of that, seedy brown brick started to look like actual garbage by comparison. Anybody who cared even a little about quality jumped ship immediately. But the thing that truly put brickweed in the ground was legalization. When Colorado and Washington voted to legalize, with stores opening around 2014, everything changed. Suddenly, you had legal dispensaries selling cheap, high-quality, lab-tested weed right out in the open. And once that started spreading, the entire reason to smuggle low-grade brickweed up from Mexico just evaporated. Why would anybody buy seedy 2% brick when they could get 20% legal weed for a similar price? And the numbers behind this collapse are genuinely staggering. The price Mexican farmers got for their weed crashed from around $100 a kilo down to $30, sometimes even less. It stopped being worth growing at all, and the amount of weed getting seized at the border fell off a cliff, dropping almost 95% over about a decade. The DEA basically came right out and admitted that Mexican weed had been replaced by American-grown weed in the US market. The 40-year reign was simply over. So what did the cartels do when their original cash crop stopped making them money? They pivoted, and they pivoted to something far worse. As weed dried up as a source of profit, the Mexican cartels shifted over to way harder things. Things that don't need thousands of acres of farmland or thousands of workers, and they bring in way more money. So the same organizations that once got rich selling America cheap weed are now the ones flooding it with worse stuff. And the farmers who used to grow it simply walked away. Up in the Mexican mountains, growers who had planted marijuana for generations started abandoning the crop entirely because there was just no money left in it. Some switched to other crops. Some quit farming altogether. The weed that supplied America for 2 straight generations quietly stopped being planted. So here's the strange note to end on. Brickweed is basically gone now, and believe it or not, some people actually miss it. Not because it was good, because it definitely wasn't. But for a whole generation, that brown, seedy brick was their first ever joint, passed around a basement or a concert parking lot. And there's a real argument that weak, 2% weed with a mellow social buzz was a lot easier to just hang out on than the 25% stuff that can knock you flat today. So the garbage weed that everybody spent decades complaining about turned out to be the thing a whole lot of people grew up on. In the end, it ruled America not because it was good, but because it was cheap. It was everywhere, and there was simply nothing better around. And the moment something better finally showed up, it vanished almost overnight.